Cynthia, how are you?
I'm good. Hi, Jenna. Good to see you.
Good to see you. You look like you're in a professional office with oh, look, I see your book in the background. Is that
I'm
your
like,
marketing strategy?
that is right over my little shoulder, right?
Well, at some point, Jay's going to share a screenshot of all of your books. But when I was just getting prepped for this conversation, I realized how many books on this subject you have churned out. I feel like you are a national treasure on the state of men, misogyny, extremism, polarization, all of the things.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Yeah.
holding it all and then also finding a way to get it out.
Well, I can't help it. I mean, as I was saying to you earlier, I used to think like I had to write, and now I think I get to write, right? Like, so I
Ooh.
used to think it was like something I had to do because it's part of my job as a professor. But at some point, I realized like I get to write, and I love writing, and I love explaining things, and so I'm really happy to be here. So thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Though I am going to say, on behalf of having been an author myself and the rodeo that comes with trying to birth a book, do you, I have sympathy when you say, I'm a professor and I get to write. Like, you guys have to write.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it is
I
my
sort of,
job.
I,
Right.
I sort of feel bad about that. I mean, it has made people be like, "Oh, we should listen to her," and I'm having you on because I believe the world should be listening to you.
Yeah.
But it is quite an undertaking. How long does it take you to churn out a book, and how many more do we have
Yeah, it takes
in
me,
us?
it's like it's about 2 years now for a book. It used to be like my first books when I was really doing field work. My first two books were in Germany, and I was doing interviews and field work, and those were like a decade each, right? So they took a really long time. And then now I write books more that are to explain things to the public. They're less academic-y, and they're more for kind of hopefully a more popular audience, to explain things for parents, for teachers, for coaches, people who work with youth in all kinds of caregiver roles. And that takes a little bit less time because it's not as like I don't have to go collect 100 interviews and then come back and report back. And I have a whole team. I have a lab now who's analyzing data, and then we draw from that on a whole bunch of publications, including in my book. So it's faster now. And yeah, I don't think I'll be stopping anytime soon. There's still
Good.
enough to
Please
say.
don't. Please don't. Like, someone has to put it in writing. I feel like sometimes I'm like, well, are we even going to get to a future generation where there's a time capsule where people are going to be like, ooh, what were they thinking then? And when I think about the books that need to be part of the time capsule, like yours and Man Up are part of that, because there is a moment, there is a temperature. We are at a crossroad. I don't understand what's happening. I have my own hypotheses. I see it with my son. I see it with my current sitting president. What the hell is going on?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing you have to say, and this tends to be a very touchy and controversial thing to say, which it shouldn't be, but is that men and boys are suffering. That it is like there are very real grievances and some perceived grievances, but the data is terrible about what's happening for boys and young men in particular in terms of the loneliness. The data shows that half of American men say their online lives are more rewarding than their offline lives. 25% of men under 30 say they don't have a single friend, right? Like they have much higher rates of suicide, of what we call deaths of despair, which are overdoses and alcohol fueled deaths, right? 3/4 of those. So, they're not, the economic labor market outlooks have declined. Women are still suffering, and it's not a comparison situation. I think you can say like women bear the brunt of violence from men. Women still get paid less than 100% of what men, less than 90 cents on the dollar. And so those things are true, and men are declining on almost all of those outcomes. Boys and men are now 40% of university graduates, right? So both things are true at the same time. You don't say we don't have to address the crises that continue for girls and women, but you do have to address the fact that this exists. And then that meets this easy explanation online that scapegoats feminism, girls, women, the LGBTQ community, minorities, anybody else, and says they're to blame for your problems. So, I think the scapegoating is easier than demanding structural solutions. And no party has come up with structural solutions that address the issues. They just use this to manipulate, I think, the situation into getting more support.
Okay. So, Cynthia, you just like fire hosed us with what feels like, honestly, a little bit of a stump speech. Not that I think you've
Yeah.
like wrapped your arms around it. Like, okay, we get the data exists. What I'd love to hear from folks in chat is, do you feel like your virtual relationships are more rewarding than your in-person relationships? Because Cynthia, like, I actually think I might be in that category myself. I mean, I have children who are like climbing into bed and like hanging on me all the time. And I see joy. And I'm also like want to put them away when they're not going to sleep at night. So there's that kind of interaction. But I do find that like my community and the people that I can get to quickly aren't at my coffee shop, aren't at like school drop off. Like, I feel like my online community spaces are really important. And we're obviously here at Land of End desperately trying to create more of a virtual community here. Help me understand a little bit why virtual spaces sometimes might be missing the mark for what it is that we need as humans.
Yeah, I think, I would never say, and this is, I think, one of the things that a lot of adults get wrong when they're talking to kids about this is they get super sanctimonious or preachy about like online lives more generally, and like as if it's, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that's not what we want. You have to acknowledge there's a ton of great things about online spaces. We are, it's especially for people who are disabled, right? Like all kinds of people who can't get out, who have young children, who might not have the ability to go out and meet people in person quite as easily, who have compromised immune systems. I mean, there's a million categories of people who really thrive and benefit from online. And then all of us can benefit from those connections. And so that can be true. And you can suffer if you don't have in-person connections, even physical touch, or the ability to be vulnerable without the kind of guarded nature that can happen online. If you think, oh, I might be recorded, or I'm not sure if this person is really have my back, right? Like you're a little bit more performative sometimes online, a little bit more presentation of self.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And so there's a kind of
definitely
authenticity and trust,
correct.
right?
Right. And everyone's so allergic to some level of their own authenticity that it's not like it's a space where it comes out. Yeah, I can appreciate
and
that.
you're vulnerable to like there's bad actors who seep into some of those online communities and can attack, and that's where we see a lot of the misogyny and the racism pop up like kind of in casual or normalized ways in live chats or in in places that kind of normalize that. And so that can also like make certain kinds of people more susceptible to harms that happen online in surprising spaces. So it's like a trusted small group of your friends out to grab a coffee or go to a festival or listen to music live is still going to be a little bit different than if all your time is spent online. And you don't have any of that offline. We know that that tracks with young men and boys feeling more isolated and lonely also, and saying that they don't have any real friends, or quote, no one really knows me. There's a lot of agreement with that statement, like that nobody really knows who they are.
When you use the phrase deaths of despair, which I'm familiar with in that it's been lurking for 5-8 years now, it is so heartbreaking. It is like such a heartbreaking concept to me because it feels like what we're actually looking at is a demographic of people who haven't really been able to see and be seen, that their dignity of bearing witness to or having somebody bear witness to their life experience has been robbed of them. Recognizing that I see that social media has played a part of that, but loneliness or the distance and the inauthenticity that is created with virtual lives, like it just strikes me that this is a tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate in your intro that you were saying this isn't to usurp what's happening with women and girls.
Right.
It's just not the conversation that we're having right now.
Right.
And you can sequence them all day long, moment by moment, case study by case study. But it is really fascinating to have an expert like you in a space like Twitch, of which, like, I'm technically a foreigner. Like, this is like a new sandbox for me.
Yeah.
I'm really, really enjoying it because I'm having come from the talking head space on traditionally right media. It's nothing but like sound bites slinging back and forth at each other. No one's really able to get to the thing. But in a lot of our conversations, we have been able to get vulnerable here
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
on Twitch. And the first series we launched was about boys and men, specifically
Yeah.
because we're like, that's who's here. And there's work here.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about what you know about Twitch and um, some of the warning signs around a platform like this as it applies to the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Twitch and other spaces that, whether we're talking about like Steam or Discord, like spaces that allow for communities to be formed that are often populated by a lot of boys and men and can kind of become echo chambers sometimes, or can become places that don't have um, that can be super positive but also can have some negative kind of components to it in certain parts of it, I think is where we are in terms of the possible gateways or rabbit holes that can open up to more harmful kinds of things. And so, one of the things we see in the lab that I run in the gaming space more broadly is that, like, games get demonized all the time for their connection to violent extremism, and that in ways that aren't really true, right? Like there isn't a connection between the violent nature of a game and mass violent or radicalization, mobilization to mass violence more broadly. But there are connections to some of the misogyny, sexism, and, like, hateful rhetoric that happens and gets normalized in online spaces, like in the live chat features, and also sometimes in the narrative framing, right? Where it's like this super heroic rescue, but violent kind of men of an honorable age framing that often positions women in a more submissive role.
Oh,
And
interesting.
and so, like, some of that kind of normalization, if you will, like that can contribute to kind of a climate in which people can be more receptive to real propaganda or framings that are, and this is true for men and women. And somebody asked in the chat, like, are women just more likely to reject misogyny these days? We do see that, but we also have like huge spaces cropping up that are like um, the womanosphere, it's called, or of trad wives, like where you have women who are
Yeah.
really embracing like much more traditional submissive roles. And again, like, that's free choice, but it is also like kind of fed by this kind of culture, a lot broader kind of cultural questions. So in terms of like the warning signs, real quick, I would just say, like, the warning signs of mobilization of violence are pretty much the same as other types of warning signs. Like, and so parents usually can say, like, there's something off there. My kid's isolating himself from his friendship group, or he's starting to use like um, uh, more secretive about stuff, like, behavioral changes that can indicate like a problem with like sort of drug use or self-harm or suicidality, right? The same kinds of things often are underpinning a turn toward violent mobilization. You just can't quite, so it's like the warning signs are similar in terms of psychological behavioral things to look out for, which is reassuring. Like, if a kid's in need of support, they're in need of support, and you sometimes have to go deeper to find out what's going on.
I have to go back to something you said,
Yeah.
which is a debate, an issue. It's not going well, or it's not going in my husband's favor at all. And
Yeah.
for transparency's sake, Cynthia knows my husband personally. You just, if I think I heard you correctly, the violent games
Yeah.
aren't contributing to the violence.
Right.
It's the messaging and the narrative of the like saviorism,
Yeah.
strongman theory, save the woman. Someone in chat mentioned that women are often spies, not to be trusted. I interpret that as they're the brains of the operation, but maybe that's just me desperate to grab the bull by the horns. I can't actually, I don't know if I am willing to ascribe or affirm that statement, because it does feel like some of these violent games like numb us to violence.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so let me tell, like, so we've been hearing this since Columbine, right? And what's,
Mhm.
like, it's the games, Like, you can see so much, and the evidence really doesn't show that the games themselves, that the violence in games contributes to more violence offline. But where that does happen is real violence. And I'm much more concerned about the very real violent footage that comes across kids and teenagers' feeds. So one of the things I've been talking about this whole semester with high school students is what happened on February 26th, and I bet a bunch of people in this chat know what I'm talking about, when Instagram reels were filled for 24 hours with super violent content, live stream suicides, murders, animal abuse, child abuse. And Meta issued an apology the next day, which ran in like CNN and Reuters with the title like, Meta fixes the algorithm problem, right? Like that led some users' feeds to be flooded with violent content. It was horrible. And kids I talked to who told me about it said, they couldn't get it off their feeds. They got, and one of the teachers in the room at one point said, wait a second, are you telling me like last Tuesday you saw like a murder over lunch and then you had to come take my math test? And, they're like, yeah, that's what happened. And then I asked them, like, well, what are how do you handle that? And they said, we feel kind of numb. You just get kind of numb about the violence. You get kind of apathetic about it. Like, I'm way more worried about that than I am about violent video games. Like, I don't love the violence
Okay.
in video games, but like real footage, like, why are we letting social media companies get away with errors in the algorithm without providing mental health support to the kids that saw that? That's what I'd like to know. Right.
Okay. So I can still win my argument with what you're offering me.
Yes.
It is this. I have often felt and have heard other people say, I'm sure I reposted it. I certainly am not the originator of this idea, but that specifically over the past 6, 8, 10 years, we've seen so much carnage. And depending on what your algorithm is related to Ukraine or Gaza, Iran now, if the algorithm was considered enough to include the other 33 conflict zones in the world, that our hearts, like as a species, we're not equipped to be able to absorb so much of that violent content. Because if we're just like, I don't know, this is when I go back to like the justifying us as a species, even though I know that the way that I'm interpreting is via Darwin, and Darwin's been entirely misinterpreted. But that, like, if you see an urge, if you see somebody bleeding, you like jump into a different state of action.
Yeah.
So if the thing is that we're becoming numb to the reality of other people around the world, then ultimately isn't that backfiring on our own relationships with ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, so what you're talking about is like the dehumanization that somebody, mentioned in the chat. There's this kind of normalization, there's a dehumanization, and then there's like just actual trauma, which I think can be an overused term, but we know that kids in particular who accidentally saw like ISIS beheading videos or who saw footage of people jumping out of the towers on 9/11 not all kids, but some of them experience symptoms that are just the same as if they were there in person, just seeing the footage, right? So seeing footage of something traumatic, particularly when you're young, um, the evidence shows that it can lead to symptoms of PTSD, and in a chronic kind of a way, right? A different than like an acute immediate incident. And that I kind of worry about. The numbness is one sign of it, desensitization, the kind of apathetic response to it, the feeling like this is just how online lives are, which are all things like we've heard from kids and teenagers who experience this. And that's where like some of the more time you spend online can be harmful, because you start to just become like more immune to that, and you're more likely to see that online than you are in person, right? Even if you live in a chronically violent place, it's not likely to be like out of the blue while you're like 1 second watching like a
Constant,
video
constant,
of somebody
constant. Right.
singing, and then suddenly you see like a live stream shooting from a university campus. So it's that unpredictability too, I think, that causes some harm.
And then in terms of the narrative,
Yeah.
particularly as I don't know, I feel like objectifying, help me understand the language that should be used around how some of these video games
Yeah.
personify women, their roles, and then ultimately what the men do to it. And then if you could just connect that
Yeah.
to
I mean,
misogyny.
there's some of it is like there's definitely some games where you have like such hypersexualization of women characters, of female characters. You have submissive roles, supportive roles. You have you have misogynistic like Gamergate and Gamergate 2, like the kinds of things that have happened in the gaming community that are like,
Sorry, I
yeah,
don't know what those
yeah.
things are. Do you
So
mind?
yeah, sure. So these are like massive trolling and harassment campaigns against coders and designers who are either women or who are companies that are promoting more diverse characters in games, right? And so there have been some just awful, um, real like threats, harassment in over like one was a decade ago and the other was just this past year. Like I think it was the spring of 2024 was where Sweet Baby Inc., that company that was trying to get more diverse characters into gaming, got just attacked and trolled. And so it was referred to as like Gamergate 2. And so there are like real episodes like that where there's like serious misogyny and hate directed in the gaming community toward women. There are also instances where it's just sort of like exclusionary, like you're not allowed to be here. This is not a space for you. It's too PC. It's woke, right? Wokeism creeping in, that kind of feeling. That's the kind of accusation that's said. But then there's the narrative content in the games themselves, which, you know, even when they're not games that are like, lock her up, like a game that was about Clinton, right? Hillary Clinton. Like there are games like that are just, right, like bad actor games. But even the mainstream regular games often have female characters that are treated as sexual objects, as prizes, as submissive, helpless women to be rescued, right? Rather than as kind of equal combatants or players in their own right. And that kind of framing, and also the expectation that the men are being heroic,
Right.
restoring with violence some kind of phoenix-like rise from the ashes of a civilization, or ready to be violent at any moment. That valorization of violence as a character of dominance, aggression, as a character of manhood, comes through there too. So those are kind of subtle things, and we see them in everyday life all the time too. It's not just games, but reflecting that culture and expectation of what being a man is in the game contributes to that.
I have to tell you, Cynthia, like I had to go through my own process as a woman who was dating at one point, and then choosing a spouse, to like come to terms with all of those narratives myself.
Yeah,
Like
me too.
the
Yeah,
fake Prince Charming, like,
yeah.
y'all. However you objectify us in video games, you're just as objectified, and we're equally as disappointed.
Yeah, I mean, me too. I think we all do, because we live in a culture that polices gender norms like incredibly strongly. There's one of my favorite studies over the last year, like nerdy academic moment here, was a study that of high school boys in the US that showed that high school boys have become increasingly accepting of same-sex relationships between boys as long as you're bro about it, right? Like you can't be
Uh,
flamboyantly gay,
right.
right? And so like I'll have to use a slur, but the slur's in the title. It says like it's okay to be gay, it's not okay to be a fag. Like that's the culture. So like sexuality has become more fluid, but the research shows that masculinity is super rigid and stays as rigid as ever and gets really policed by other boys in those environments, by girls and by boys. And so that's really fascinating to me that like we'll see change in some areas, like broader acceptance, despite all the backlash and anti-LGBTQ stuff happening right now. You see broader acceptance among a younger generation of more fluidity, more pronoun use, more right, just different expectations. But masculinity is super rigid and as rigid as ever, maybe even more rigid than it has been.
Can you, that you teed up my next question.
Yeah.
Is what's the day today? June 17th at 2:37 EST. On this day in on this page in our history,
Yeah.
I feel like it's more heavy than it's been. If I think about it as a boulder,
Yeah.
maybe I'm looking more different. Like, I don't know, but it just feels like it's bigger and rolling faster and more in my way. And is it worse than it was in the aughts, 90s, 80s, 70s?
I mean, worse in different ways, right? Like you look at my mom in the 60s who was told by her dad, I mean, she was her class valedictorian, like perfect SAT scores, brilliant
Obviously,
woman, would not, her
obviously.
dad wouldn't pay, thank you. Her dad wouldn't pay for college because she was a girl, right? And so she went anyway and paid for it herself by waitressing, but like and she never told us until after he died because she just she's like that was the culture of the time, right? And when I think about that, I went to the same college as she went to 25 years later and had a full scholarship, but like didn't I waitressed at the same place, but the thought that I would have to cover tuition because my dad would have said something like that was unheard of, right? And so I think you have to acknowledge that like there was a time not so long ago when a whole generation of women, I mean, she was turned down for promotions at work because she was a woman, right? Like you couldn't do that now in the same way as overtly, right? Like that's really different. And at the same time, I also think, and the data shows things are worse now and the gender divide is growing among Gen Z politically, like the polarization in Gen Z along gender and gender lines is so much worse than it is for millennials and for Gen X. It's about on par with like some boomer data. And so that's that's data, right? Like that's there and it is definitely happening. Young men are being pulled to the right, to more conservative traditional views about gender, and young women are going further toward progressive, are more likely to call themselves feminists than any other generation. And young men are less likely to identify as feminists than older generations of men. So that is, you're right. Like your perception is right. That is worse than it was. And like 50 years ago, things were still pretty bad. And so we have to
Yeah, yeah.
acknowledge progress, even as we see like things have gotten worse in the last decade.
Okay, here are like the 7 different directions I want to go in. I do want to talk about trad wives,
Yeah.
because I see it lurking in a way that I feel like we might be in like quarter 1 of what this thing could be, and I sort of want to jump on it more quickly,
Yeah.
and see what I can do about it. I see Master Liberty has arrived. He is the captain of our cheerleading squad, and has some very strong opinions. So I'm excited to hear what he has to say. But but is the reason that particularly on the right it's become easier to weaponize misogyny or let it bubble up because it's so much easier to hold on to than it is to do that whole self-compassion, self-reflection
Mhm.
thing, that like I'm lonely, I have no, I don't think I'm good enough to try to make friends, I don't think I'm good enough to try out for that baseball team, I don't, like all of this sort of feeling not enough instead of owning up or instead of running at those myths, it's much easier to blame somebody else. It's much easier to blame women. It's much easier to blame Hillary Clinton or emails in Benghazi.
Yeah, I think there's like two things happening at the same time. One is like how boys and men feel across the board and what makes them vulnerable to propaganda or scapegoating language online that comes from influencers, that comes when they run a self-help search, right? And they're like looking for guidance on how to get their life together, how to get a girlfriend, and run into somebody like Andrew Tate, right? Or the thousand
Right.
guys like him, who opens up every one of his videos, by the way, by saying first thing, men are suffering and I'm the only one who will talk about it, right? So creating that stage for acknowledging that, but then scapegoating, right? So that's happening. But then you also have like, you know, populist, authoritarian, anti-democratic leaders and movements attacking gender, and that's happening across the globe. So like you
Mhm.
look at something like Hungary, Viktor Orban, who attacked universities there and closed gender studies program, closed women's studies programs, right? Like gender becomes in a way like the canary in the coal mine, and men who consume more misogynistic content are more likely to vote for authoritarian candidates. So there's this whole nexus there. Like it's being used as a strategy to lure voters who by, you know, we saw that with anti-trans mobilization, we saw that with you know, women's reproductive rights coming into play. Like it's a play, right? It's a playbook too. And so the language is out there, easy to grasp on, but why somebody's vulnerable to it, you know, also is because there's real suffering and real grievances that have to be addressed.
But I'm still struggling with why gender's the dividing line. Is
Yeah.
that just because it's the most obvious thing where it's like, I feel shitty about myself, who's the closest person or who's a person in closest proximity that I can blame?
Yeah. Well, we've had, I mean, one is that there've been a lot of gendered social changes. I mean, and race is also on the chopping block, like all the DEI, right? I mean, it's gender and race being attacked on the by political leaders, immigration, right? It just depends on which country you're in. In this country, it's, you know, it's not just gender, but gender is what I've been working on. So it's one of, and it is the most common dividing line right now on the polarization. I think one, there's been a lot of gendered social changes. Like we have this acceptance of gender fluidity that's really different from a decade ago. I mean, as a teacher, right, a faculty member, 10 years ago, I would never have really had students introduce themselves with pronouns. Like that's normative now,
Right,
right?
right,
It's like
right, right.
it's changed quickly. And anytime you have rapid social change, you also see backlash. And so some of that is because there's been rapid social change. There's been legalization of same-sex marriage. There's been, you know, normalization in some ways of Pride Month, and you know that all that stuff that has also produced backlash and rising hate incidents that are terrible. So I'm not saying it's like all sunny and, you know, roses, but there's been progressive social change, and then of course there's backlash to that. So we see some of that. That backlash creates an environment where a lot of these kinds of things are circulating. And then you have the social media landscape of like influencers, manipulators, profiteers who are literally trying to sell stuff to boys and young men to make their jawline stronger, like to like stale chewing gum, right? The looks maxing stuff, the, you know, the harmful content that comes to them to try to turn them into a certain kind of man, that they're being sold something at a subscription rate or sold a product, right? So there's many different factors happening that are coalescing. I think it's more like it's not like a linear, thank God, because I'm not good at math. Like it's not like a linear formula, right? It's like a toxic stew of a lot of things happening at the same time that are leading to this outcome of young men, Gen Z men being drawn to more traditional conservative views about gender.
Is the way is and I don't believe that Andrew Tate or anybody else is like taking a playbook out of like cosmetics and insecurity
Right.
makeup from the 1950s 40s selling vacuums or mixers, that this is what will make you whole as a woman type thing.
Right.
But is that sort of the same thing, which is like for women, we have to have certain eyelashes. Hello.
Right.
Like we
Yeah.
have to look a certain way. Hello. Like I show up in
Yeah.
ways that I believe society, that I believe benefits me in the broader public domain.
Yeah.
Um, but is it like this is just the capitalization of men's insecurities
Yeah.
and inheriting generations and generations of men who have stopped emotionally maturing at the age of 9, 10, 11, 12 because we're told not to have they're told not to have friends, or their relationship with sports is more important than their friendships. They're definitely told not to
Yeah.
cry. That it's sort of like, okay, let's just meet them where they are at that emotional state, and let's capitalize on it by selling them stale gum to make their jawlines
Right,
stronger.
right. Yeah, I mean, this is like the gender policing that's always been there for girls, and for young women, and to some extent always been there for men, and now is met with this stream of content that either sells or manipulates or is trying to um, profit off of those same kinds of things, and that can drive a much faster uptick in it. So we see now that boys represent 30%, boys and young men represent 30% of eating disorders, for example. That we have, it's two and a half,
Sorry, can I
right? Sorry.
interrupt you for
Yeah,
one
yeah,
quick second though? But isn't that one of those statistics that like if we were measuring it for the past 50, 60 years,
yeah,
it would probably the same, right? Like that whole thing of like, oh, well now we have 46% of the people who are left-handed, and it's like, no, they were just
yeah,
beaten by their
yeah.
teachers if they were using their left hand, that we've always had left-handed folks.
Yeah, like there've always been boys with eating disorders, and there are more boys now going to optimize their bodies with like jaw enhancing surgery, plastic surgery, shin lengthening surgery, right? Like,
Ow.
right? Like flying off to like Turkey to do that, as a young man did from the UK and died last year or the year before, right? So like this extreme fixation on bodybuilding, fitness, the uptick in that kind of content that comes across, that is associated then, and again, like I work out multiple times a week, like I was a
Yeah,
college
yeah, yeah.
athlete, like a no, I'm not condemning that. It's the idea that that's the only way to be as a woman or a man, that that's the way to perform and live your gender, that I think is like that there's a successful version of this, and that's
Correct.
going to lead
Right.
to your economic success, your sexual success, like everything
Mhm.
else. That's where it's like gets really harmful.
Master Liberty, I would love to hear some more of your thoughts specifically related to your relationship with misogyny, or how you see it in your life, or how you see it, because I know that we like to talk about constitution here, systems, but how you see that playing out. And Cynthia, maybe I could then give you more of an opportunity to talk about what the world is going to be blessed with in your forthcoming book, Man Up: The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism. What is the new misogyny? Like,
Yeah.
how is today's different than it was a year ago, 10 years ago?
Yeah, so the new misogyny is like related to the online worlds. Like there always has been misogyny, but there's a documented uptick in online misogyny and harassment since about 2011, which is like shortly after social media kind of kicks in terms of the experience that people have, right? And that's true also of anti Semitism, where we have like 83% of American Jews saying that they've experienced online anti Semitism. Like there's just people are experiencing more harassment based on their identities than has been in the past. But what's different about misogyny is that it's also the common thread across almost every mass shooting or violent extremist act, terrorist act. So every mass shooter terrorist I can think of in the US, all the way back to Oklahoma City, basically had some history of domestic intimate partner violence, stalking threats, harassment against women, rape threats, or sexual assault, um, and or was making threats or bragging about having assaulted physically LGBTQ folks. So there's like this pattern of earlier history of interpersonal violence that is gendered, and then a later escalation to mass violence. And that's what the book is about, is that like in my field, in the field of prevention of violent extremism, we sort of have ignored that for a really long time. We talk about it when it comes to Islamist terrorists, like the Yazidi women or the Al-Shabaab or the Nigerian schoolgirls. Like we talk all the time about the exploitation of girls and women and young boys by Islamist terrorists. We don't talk about it when it comes to mass shooters or violent actors here in the US. And this is true of the assassination attempts in Minnesota also.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time making the connection between like Boko Haram and one-offs here in Minnesota.
So these are like, so what I'm arguing in the book is that this underlying climate of rising misogyny is also what's underpinning, is part of the drive of the underpinning of a rise of violent extremism that we've also had. And so as you see, like, so terrorists overseas, we've got a dozen UN reports talking about how Islamist terrorists abuse, exploit women. We have the same problems here, both as a precursor to violent mobilization and exploitation by groups that are like white supremacist groups running prostitution rings, for example. And we just don't really talk about it. There's no reports by, the UN talking about the problem of domestic violent extremism and misogyny. And so we don't talk about the fact that every mass shooter, including like ones that you don't think of, like Parkland school shooting, right? Or the Uvalde, Texas shooter, right? Or at an elementary school, or the Maryland newsroom shooter, like all had some kind of history of gendered violence that happened before. That could have been a warning sign, that could have been an early mobilization indicator, right? And we just sort of don't pay attention to that. And so part of the book is laying out how ordinary misogyny can open pathways to mass violence. And if we want to take seriously the prevention of mass violence, we also have to look at these ordinary forms of misogyny.
Cynthia, I mean, I will probably say 4 more times in this conversation that I believe one of my most important jobs is raising my son differently. And I don't exactly know what the differently is, but it is differently. It's not making the exceptions. And that is like an evening by evening debate in my head. Like, is this where I draw a line? Oh, great. He's not paying attention. Right. What do I do? But could you actually define misogyny? There is a question in the chat that I want to run at, because I don't, or a comment, because I think at the when George Floyd was murdered and a lot of DEI related efforts were surfacing, I felt like the right kept saying reverse racism. I wrote a lot about this in my book, and there's no such thing. There's no such thing. And so I wanted sexism bad regardless of which way it goes. Right. I want to make sure that we are drawing a very clear line about what sexism is toward women, why misogyny, understanding the difference of it, because sometimes I think when men interrupt women, or when I'm sitting across from like a male Republican and we're debating whatever might be, and they like interrupt me, or they like, that's so ridiculous, or you're just a radical liberal. Like, that's also just like an asshole. But I would probably qualify it in like, you're just not interested in my opinion because of my views, and also a little bit because I'm a woman. Like, I would still put that on the misogynistic spectrum. Right. So help me understand the misogynistic spectrum, and then also why that's different than sexism.
Yes. Okay. So here's the professor little explanation of this. So we live in a patriarchy, right? We live in, everybody lives in a patriarchy, which is a system of power relations that gives men more power over most women, right? So most men automatically get a little bit more power. Those things have been changing over time, but they rest on, that system of power relations rests on sort of 2 sets of things. One is sexism, which is attitudes that imply or believe that women are less qualified or inherently deceitful, or for whatever reason don't deserve that power. And misogyny, which is like the law enforcement function of patriarchies. It's the policing function. So keep women in their place with slurs, with harassment, with belittling, with tools that contain women in their place, right? Sexism is the set of attitudes, misogyny is the gender policing. So sexism as a set of attitudes often leads to policies, like until 1974, women could not open a bank account in the US without a man's signature as a cosigner, right? Couldn't get a credit card. So, you that's not that long ago. I know 1974 feels like a really long time ago, but it's, these women are now women who had to be adults under that set of circumstances are like 75 or 80 now, right? Like they could not, open a bank account. And so that also sets up a whole world of cultural norms and expectations that women aren't as qualified, they can't be relied on to make decisions financially, that they shouldn't have paid employment. Like legally, for a long time, women had to be let go from their jobs when they were pregnant, right? Like you can't do both things at the same time, be a parent and a teacher, for example, in pre 1970s. So that first generation of feminism and women's rights movements were pushing for those legal things. That's to eradicate some of the sexist laws. Misogyny then polices when those things start to change. So some people think misogyny is hatred of women. I don't use it that way. I use it the way Kate Mann, a philosopher, describes it, as the law enforcement function. It's how you try to keep women in their place. There is also misandry, which is, antagonistic attitudes and beliefs towards men, right? So you see that, but that's not what sexism or misogyny is in terms of how we
Can
define
you
it.
give me an example of misandry?
So
You were
people who
commuting.
say that men are inherently violent, right, or would say that men can't be trusted or will always cheat, and so therefore you should cheat first, right? Or that it's okay to take advantage of men financially, right? That they're just wallets or simps, right? Like that there's that kind of stuff. And I should say, like, gender policing happens to boys all the time too, right? With
Mhm.
all the slurs that get told, you throw like a girl, you get accused of being women's body parts that I won't say, but like, it's so common to accuse boys of not doing their gender properly, right? So it's not just girls and women who are that suffer from patriarchal policing and norms and expectations. Boys and men do too, by being made to feel that they're not man enough. And that's why I called the book Man Up, because that's the kind of message. It's just so common, like, man up, you got to man up here and not cry.
Your book looks at 5 misogynistic strategies used by policing societies like
Mm-hmm.
ours.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
mean, the credit card. I guess I'm curious. I would love everyone who's in the chat to just like think about where there are misogynistic, and it's just like it's not policies. I guess what you're saying
Right.
is misogyny is a active policy.
Yeah. I mean, there
Um,
still are policies. Like, it's just less common. I mean, this whole question of should women be allowed to be in combat roles in the military? Should, like in Russia, there's still like some 100+ occupations that women aren't allowed to do, right? Like be a miner or a firefighter, right? Like different types of things that are just, so that's because women are deemed to be less capable. And so there's still kind of like some legal restrictions around the world. I mean, we didn't get the right to vote until 1920, right? So there's legal restrictions like that are based on sexist beliefs. But now, most misogyny now, the policing is done through strategies like what I call containment, which is trying to keep people in their box, right? And that's why you see so many gendered slurs in gaming spaces, but also like metaphors like lock her up, send them back, keep her barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, right? These containment, like keep a woman where she's supposed to be, or LGBTQ folks, like back in the closet, right? The same kind of idea, contain gender to very defined roles. So that's one of the chapters. And I talk about how those everyday experiences of containment can shape the way that people think about the entitlement they have to women's domestic labor or sexual gratification. And then that policing that happens when they don't get it is one of those warning signs that can lead toward mass violence, like we're seeing in a bunch of school shooters and other types of mass shooters.
what role does religion play in this? Specifically, like conservative Christianity.
Yeah. I mean, so this gets like, this gets starts to cross into things like the trad wives too, where I want to be clear that like people have a right to choose like a traditional gendered lifestyle. Like if you want to be a traditional wife, like you want to be a traditional breadwinner for a family, and everyone agrees to that, no problem. So there's something called like biblical patriarchy, which is, part of a kind of evangelical Christian belief system in some cases that says, men should be the breadwinner, women should be the caregivers, and that creates like very fixed rules. I think where that becomes problematic is if you don't have choices. And so the trad wife phenomenon, in which women choose to be in more submissive roles, give up paid employment, where that becomes problematic, and we've seen this with lots of women who have left those movements or left that lifestyle. I mean, there's lots of things that are problematic about it in terms of its performance online too. But it's also that, like, if you've given up the right to earn an income or to have a degree, and then you change your mind and you've cut off options for yourself, so relinquished power and then don't have choices, that's where it becomes kind of hard. And so, I think what we want is to optimize the ability for people to make choices that give them the most sort of freedom and degree of movement.
That's so PC.
Yeah, I mean, and you also have to acknowledge, like, this as a mom too. Like, it's very seductive, I think, in many ways to like, it's hard to work and raise kids. It's so expensive. It's so expensive. Our caregiving expectations in this country, like what the culture puts on moms and what the cost of childcare is, more than what a lot of people would earn, especially in cities. Of course, it doesn't make sense. Like, why are you running yourself ragged? Why not take this time? And so I understand why it's seductive. It's the same way that like the maker space has become super, popular, like this return to something calmer, where you're building something with your hands. And like, I get that too. It's
Yeah, yeah.
just, are you like opting out in a way that reduces your choices later?
Yeah. I mean, I spent a lot of time talking about that in my book, where the most privileged option a lot of American women are focused on, or the choice that they get to make, is that after they've been engaged, after they got the grades, got into undergrad, found a partner, got the ring, had the wedding, if they were lucky enough to get pregnant, that like 3 months before they had their first, they were asked the most privileged question that like almost any demographic in the whole entire world gets to choose, which is, are you going to work or continue to stay at home?
Right.
And I have so much guilt personally, because I am so, like, in some ways I embody a lot of the patriarchal nature of like grabbing the bull by the horns, and I have my own like misogynistic experiences and beliefs in boardrooms that I have, that I haven't yet, that I have my own biases that I haven't really seen. But I have so much guilt about not being able to juggle all of it and have this big bubbling career. And so I totally can sympathize with
Yeah,
the
me too.
desire to just be focused on the character and the story that we've all been told. How
Yeah.
can I just get to her closer? Like, I'll go get like Botox. I mean, I happen to get Botox, but like, what do I do to just like be more her? Now I'm actively trying to unpackage her and like fall on the sword so that my daughter doesn't feel like she's comparing herself to the same things. But it feels like the stories we're telling, both boys and girls, and then ultimately where women sort of fall back on when they don't feel like they're clear on their purpose or what it is that they want to go get, is like, oh, just try to go be her or him.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, and I think one of the things that we don't do enough is create spaces like what you're doing right here to have these conversations, especially with boys, because boys and young men. And so when I was talking to a bunch of high school students in the spring, and one of the high schools I was in, one of the boys came up to me afterward, and there was this cluster of kids around me, and he said, what of all the, I've done interviews with boys and men my whole career, right? So he's like, of all the things you've heard, like, what is it that you think people don't know about boys and men? And I said, I don't think people know how much content comes to boys and men in algorithms that kind of changes the way they see themselves as boys or as men or who they think they should be. So I said, well, what do you think? I should ask you. And he said, I don't think people understand what it's like to suddenly realize the world sees you as dangerous.
Ooh.
And so, like, he was talking about how suddenly you're in the mall with your friends and you're being regarded with suspicion, just like you've grown from a boy into suddenly someone seeing you as a man. And men, he felt, were being seen as potentially dangerous. And that was such a shock to realize. So then one of the girls right there said, well, I don't think boys understand what it's like to constantly be regarded like in a sexualized way. And he's like, you're right. I don't understand that. And so then I said, well, maybe the two of you should be having this conversation. And the fact that like they'd never been able to have that conversation before, like the school didn't create spaces. There was no other space in their lives where they could have these conversations about what they thought the other didn't know. And I think that that's just like, it was super powerful in
Yeah.
that moment. And like, I loved listening to them. And I would listen to high school students like, all day, any day, right?
Yeah.
Because of this, they'll just like they have so many thoughts that nobody asks them about these things too. And we forget when you get older because you get so used to that. Like, you get used to that expectation that you are a certain way. But that moment of transition when you're suddenly regarded as a sexual object, as a 12 or 14 or 15-year-old girl getting catcalled for the first time, or
Really
a
annoying.
boy suddenly realizing that the world sees him as a threat, like that is something that we should create spaces for boys and girls and young men and women to talk about, because it's otherwise they find other places that tell them the other one is the evil one, right?
Yeah. And, or, I mean, we've had Mark Green on here a number of times. We'll continue to. We have the
Yeah,
Boys and Men track on
great.
Mondays at 11 a.m. Um, but like, I often look at the wider world and like the nuanced individual problems and think to myself, ooh, those white ladies need to go get those white ladies, and oh, those men need to go get those men. And
Yeah.
you're obviously you identify as her, she,
Yes.
um, and but you're on the outside of this. Like, isn't this men's job to go get men?
Yeah.
Like, I know I'm sort of like, I gotta go get the Dems. I don't
Yeah.
know what I'm gonna do
No.
with them, but
Totally. Like I think this is where like I think you have to see that like I want the book to be, I've done a lot of engagement with the men's work world and men's wellness communities over the past like 6 months, just teeing up reception for the book and wanting to make sure that men see this as not just a problem that women have to address, right? And I also don't think it's a problem that just men have to address. Like women have to champion this, men have to champion this. And so and yes, like we need men to be role models of what it looks like to transition to a man, without, to grow up into manhood without having to be violent, without having to be aggressive or dominant, to be able to embrace caregiving, to embrace like a fuller range of human capacities. And people like Mark Green and others in the men's workspace are doing that so well. So I wouldn't do that, but I think that I can like have conversations. I also think that boys and men need to hear the validation, like need to hear the acknowledgement sometimes from women too, and from other girls that, that we understand that these are problems that are not mutually exclusive. Like we each have, doesn't mean it's not an either or situation. It's a both and, right?
sorry, the both end is because I want to make sure I do this, and I want to
Yeah,
make sure I have this direction from you crystal
yeah,
clear. That the both end is how can I better show up as a white woman for white
yeah.
men?
Yeah. I mean, it's the both and for me is like acknowledging that boys and men are suffering doesn't mean that we attend to boys and men at the expense of girls and women, right?
Right.
That
We can
it's
definitely
like
do both.
we have to do both. And as a white woman, as a white woman, but also as a professor, as a mother, as a wife, like as in all of my roles, I can be thinking about this and thinking about how do I shape, what are my opportunities to have conversations that create more space for people to have this type of conversation without judgment. And how do I create tools like we do in my lab to educate parents and caregivers and teachers and mental health counselors about the worlds that young people inhabit online in particular that might be subtly shaping their views about gender in ways that might not be in their own best interest always, right? And so whether that's like hostile toward themselves with like self-harm or anorexia eating disorder, or jaw length, jaw strengthening surgery or shin lengthening surgery, whatever it is, like because they get kind of a dysfunctional view of what it means to be successful as a young, beautiful or successful or financially successful through exploiting others or taking advantage of others.
Cynthia, mewing, is that part of it?
Yeah, it's part of it, right? So mewing is right.
My 7-year-old does it.
Right. And so your 7-year-old's not even on social media, but
No.
because that spreads then in a culture with older siblings or, and that's, yes.
Yeah, but
that's
it's like worse than that. I'm like, okay, what is this? And like, he was sitting on the bench at baseball the other day and I was like, hi.
Yeah.
And he like didn't do anything. He didn't blow me a kiss back. And I went like this to him, see if I could get him to like bite. And he did it back to me. I had no idea that it was like,
yeah. That's part of what we call looks maxing. It's this whole thing about maxing. It's this whole thing about like maximizing your physical appearance with an eye toward what the expectation is that the other, that women and girls want, that makes you like sexually most attractive. And so it's reinforcing this idea that there's only one standard of male beauty, and that is having this strong masculine jaw in that case, right? And so you can build the muscles up with this.
Where the hell did that come from? Like,
it comes from these same, it comes from these like influencers online. It comes from pseudoscience research, false data, like all the kind of propaganda, but also profiteers trying to sell products, and basically say that this is the way, from the pickup artist community, right? Like there's long histories of this, like of that there's ways to manipulate women to get them to date you, to minimize their resistance, and like that this is one of them, like that women want a strong jawline. I mean, that's like, and it is, or that women want taller men, right? But that it doesn't also pay attention to the expectation that like women also feel this pressure to be smaller, right? And so like it's both genders are doing this kind of same thing, often policing each other, right? With about size, about body image, about the idea of like what makes an ideal physical appearance. And then also grappling with this, like the way they're treated by others as inherently dangerous or as inherently a sexual object, right? And so all of that stuff happening at the same time, and so much of it coming across online without any places to talk about it, I think, is how we end up where we are.
Cynthia, the girls being smaller a bit is also something that my 9-year-old has been talking about, because it's being the end of the school year. There's been a lot of like field day things, and there was like a couple of relay races where people had to get on each other's like piggyback to like run a race to carry an egg across the field, whatever it is. And she was like, I'm just so sad that I'm not one of the smaller girls that like the boys can carry across the field. So like here I am like mewing, and I'm saying this like public, like I'm putting myself on the executioner block. Like here I am mewing at my kid at his little league, and my daughter, who I am trying to brainwash to be the most confident, failing young girl, is like, I wish I were smaller in size so boys could piggyback me across the field during field day more.
Right.
I mean, it's just
like, this has been generations of like women and men too. There's in some ways this like what's old is new again, right? But like so it's not like this is new, but it's what's new is the like social media pressure, the profiteers that where these things spread so fast and become part of the culture, like the mewing and other types of looks maxing. So
okay, Cynthia, before I jump into like the specific concrete strategies that you're going to suggest for all
Yeah,
of us, and we will have you back on in September for sure when the book
awesome.
drops. Um, but I wanted to hear from you. Um, do you think this is like so out of left field, but it is on topic? Do you think there are men who couldn't vote for Hillary and Kamala because they were women?
I think there are women and men who didn't vote and couldn't vote for Kamala and Hillary because they were women. I think that I mean, I remember when Obama was elected, and I thought, I was so it was such a moment to see, the first non-white president in my whole lifetime, like to see this change and to see that like we couldn't cross that barrier, we can't cross that barrier with a woman. Now maybe these are not the right candidates, but I think there's also like enough evidence that people really struggle with the expectations of women as leaders about what there's, because women are expected to be empathetic and caring and soft, right? And then there's also this expectation of a presidential leader as hard and commanding. And so there's like, it's a lose-lose situation for a lot of women in leadership roles who face these kinds of difficult expectations and trying to navigate. And then I think that's on that stage, it's just really hard. So yeah, I definitely think there were women and men who just couldn't bring themselves to see a woman in that role.
Okay. And then my next question is, I don't, and you can bail on this next question if you want to. Um, but in looking at what happened in Minnesota
Yeah.
and the mm, and the trace of or the trail of evidence that was left behind around why he was specifically targeting Democratic lawmakers
Yeah.
and then I just learned a couple of hours ago that Donald Trump wouldn't call Governor Walz to
Right.
see what he could do to assist the state, which I'm also learning is normal protocol, which makes sense. What role do you think the sitting president plays in the rise of misogyny and extremism in the U.S.?
Yeah. So, and I should say I have to go after this question because I'm about to hop on PBS NewsHour to answer the same set of questions. So you guys can
Great.
see me later tonight. It's a recorded interview for television, but the what? So you get a little preview here, which is that the president plays. There's sort of three problems happening right now with this administration and this president in particular. One is that he's normalizing rhetoric that is both hateful and paints very clearly the Democratic Party as the enemy, right? And we also see that from some Democrats. So I'm not saying it's only Republicans who are doing it, but Trump has done it really clearly by saying that the other party is, quote, the enemy within, using words like evil, dangerous, right? Saying there's going to be a bloodbath if he's not elected, right? So positioning this really clear sense of existential threat that normalizes that language that creates us versus them and shows it's really dangerous. The other party is like existentially dangerous. And then he has decimated, the administration has decimated all the resources for prevention of violent extremism as part of the DOJ cuts and beyond. And so we now have no infrastructure at the federal level to really prevent violent extremism, and that's not good. And then there's been this like legitimation of it that happens with the kind of not calling Waltz, not responding in a way that is helping lower the temperature of the climate. So it's like several different problems at once that are contributing to the fact that we now have like 3 violent plots a day being interrupted, which is a 2,000% increase from 20 years ago. So we're in like a bad situation in terms of violent extremism, which is why I wrote this book to try to understand some of the misogyny. We also have a president and other leaders who have been credibly accused in a variety of different ways of different types of violence or harm against women, or use language that is undermining women as human beings, and or diminishing them to to their physical beauty and sexual objects. So we also had like plenty of other Republicans who don't do that, right? So it's not like a complete sweep, but it's that kind of thing when he has such popularity and it's such an opportunity to be a leader on these issues, has helped to normalize some of the stuff.
Cynthia, I would love for you to respond to that last question. And in the wrap up, do you want to save your
Yeah.
concrete toolkit for September?
Yes, let's come back in September and talk about the
Great.
toolkit. And yeah, Master Liberty, I see your question. So I totally agree on the prior iterations of it, like what we called countering violent extremism, where they were like definitely targeting. What they're doing though is they're just shifting the funding to, you know, other types of, to immigration and cartels. Like, so it's not that they've gotten rid of going after people they deem violent extremists. It's just we're not going after the ones who are creating the biggest statistical risk to the nation's communities anymore, with because we don't have the prevention resources. It doesn't mean it won't happen. It just means it's on the states now. So I think we can expect the states and localities to step up in a lot of places, and we're seeing that. But that's a conversation we should have in September. So I hope Master Liberty comes back and we'll talk more.
He will. Cynthia, thank you so much. We are so excited for your book. Thank you for doing this work. Thank you for the lab. Let's bring on some of your practitioners. We all have a million questions. I'm still like broadly confused, but in a healthy state of like, tell me more, tell me where. I had no idea I was doing these things. I guess theoretically protecting them a bit in my own house. And so I need to figure out where I can break those cycles too. So good luck on PBS.
Well, don't be so hard on yourself. It's all a process. And I think the most important thing is that we don't judge each other for all of this either, right? Like we're all in process. And and we have lots of folks in the lab, including former mental health counselors and youth counselors who do our trainings. And I'd love to have some of them come on here and talk as well.
All right. Sounds good. Cynthia, good luck tonight. We will see you again soon.
Right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
See ya. Bye. She's just another amazing person who I am so relieved exists in the world. Yeah, Master Liberty. It sounds like well, it's likely that it is always supposed to fall in the states with federal programs for it if that violent extremism crosses state lines, or they're at least under enumerated. The problem is like, I think there's a lack of literacy on where misogyny actually shows up when it comes to policing or the structural systems, let alone like how it trickles down into like the way that we respond to women in emergency rooms or gender pay gaps, or what ultimately ends up happening to like the caretaking economy. Is that I think, to me, this is like the academic perspective on what I feel like is like a soul-centered challenge, which is oftentimes I find myself when I'm feeling like embarrassed or ashamed or confused, like, what else can I control that's outside of being in that state of confusion? And I find that that's what happens with men. And I'll never forget this. I was like 11, 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there. And it was right after Columbine. And that shooting like really shook me. I remember why, because soccer had just ended and I came home and I turned on the television because my parents weren't home and we were never allowed to watch TV. And because my parents weren't home, I turned on the TV and I just like watched it all unfold real time. And I remember how I could like, I know what I was wearing. I know where I was sitting on the couch, the whole thing. But it does just like strike me that we haven't developed the musculature. And I say that word a lot, but I mean it. And it's because I do a lot of yoga and I still can't do like one of the most basic moves that I have been trying to do for 3 or 4 years. It's like part of a sun salutation. It is so, so, so basic. And I cannot get my arms in the right place to be able to do it. But I don't think people are willing to recognize or see how they have been victims of a story, of a structure, that you're supposed to come out in my daughter's case, like perfectly athletic, perfectly crafty, super friendly, and then small enough for a boy to carry across the field during field day, that like she's already striving to meet the demands of a story that she never will. She never will. She's always going to be she's not going to be a beanstalk. She's has curves already. And instead of pointing to the system, because she's still young, even though we do talk about it a lot, you can imagine it's like exhausting in this house, but she still feels like shit about herself. And she's not looking at the outside world, she's just pointing that blame internally. And I think that's what most men do, is that instead of sitting back and listening and identifying exactly where in the world or what part of the story has made them feel bad about something that they have no control over, is that they would rather, in one of Cynthia's chapters, is like grab the bitch by the hair. Like it's much easier to like reallocate that anger and disappointment and despair on somebody else. And oftentimes the closest person tends to be a woman. I just feel like this is the academic approach or identification or building the language and the construct around what is human work. Because Master Liberty, I've never met you. I haven't met most of the people that end up in this chat, but I am like, you always have a chair at my dinner table, my Shabbat table, whatever, like whenever, because I'm concerned. I want to make sure that you know that you are worthy enough of your own appreciation, respect, and love. And I don't think enough people offer that to themselves. I know I am still a work in progress in doing that to myself. And I see that with so many men too. And I feel like our leaders are just so hate-filled because they're hate-filled toward themselves. Ugh. 2 cups of coffee, both lukewarm. Next couple of hours. I don't know. Are we talking about the Federalist Papers again, Master Liberty? What is your obsession with the Federalist Papers? I guess I gotta like do a whole episode. I have an idea. Why don't you come onto Twitch? We can talk about the Federalist Papers, Master Liberty. Why don't you go get that gear? I know someone who can help you get on. All right, you and Jay are going to talk about the Federalist Papers on Twitch. Okay, Jay, everybody, thank you for being here. Let's rate out. Oh, great. We're rating Girlverse. Love it. No, I know what the Federalist Papers are, but I don't think it talks about like our insecurities with ourselves. I mean, and the Constitution like fell very short language-wise in terms of like equity and self-love. I think. I don't know. Come on, Master Liberty. Go get a camera. Let's go.